Some weapons are born not for beauty, but for a purpose so blunt it leaves no room for imagination. The Colt 45 was one of them. In the early days of the Pacific Campaign, as American soldiers slogged through mud, sweat, and salt-stiffened air, the Japanese watched them with quiet amusement. They saw rifles in American hands. Yes, but they looked at the pistols and sneered. 7 heavy rounds, each a thunderclap in the hand of the shooter, seemed like a joke compared to the winking, gleaming rifles that symbolized reach and discipline. The Japanese, trained to believe in spirit, steel, and precision, laughed openly. They mocked the Americans who carried the pistols, whispering among themselves that a real soldier needed more than a toy to face a charge. And for a moment, even the Marines felt the weight of doubt. The Colt was bulky, its metal was cold, its design old. Soldiers joked quietly among themselves, trying to mask unease with humor. "She kicks like a mule," one would say, flexing a wrist after a test shot, laughter following, though in their hearts, each man knew the pistol carried history and promise in its frame. Its recoil was brutal, the sound loud, and its weight constant on a belt. Yet those who handled it understood it differently from those who watched. The Colt was not just a weapon, it was a message written in steel. Reports from earlier conflicts, from the muddy fields of World War I to the chaotic charges in the Philippines, had proven that some men could not be stopped with lighter arms. John Browning, the pistol's designer, had built it with a simple, terrifying idea. A man stops only when the steel makes him. In the sweltering heat of Guadalcanal, this idea waited quietly in every holster, in the hands of every Marine who had the courage to carry it. Shadows stretched across the palms, crickets hid the low rumble of distant gunfire, and in the midst of the jungle, Charles Evans sat on his knees cleaning his Colt. His fingers moved with the ritualistic care of someone preparing for inevitability. Slide back, chamber checked, barrel wiped clean around him. Older Marines smoked in silence, letting the jungle speak its own language of tension. One leaned in, voice low and steady. "They laugh now. Let them. They'll learn soon enough." Evans studied the weapon, its black frame dulled by salt air, its grip worn smooth from the hands of men who had relied on it before him, yet in its weight he felt steadiness, an almost defiant stubbornness. It was a quiet certainty that whispered of survival. The Japanese did not hear that whisper at first. They saw only a heavy pistol, something cumbersome, not designed for true warriors. They imagined the Americans exposed, rifles jammed, grenades spent, with nothing but a pistol between them and death. Their laughter carried through the thickets, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed as though mockery could become truth. But war is not decided by appearances. The Colt 45, each round packed with more power than the small European pistols, waited patiently in the shadows of the trees, in the pockets of sweat-stained belts, ready to speak when it was needed. And it would speak with clarity, with authority, with finality. Across the Pacific Islands from Guadalcanal to Tarawa, every encounter between soldier and enemy tested more than skill. It tested belief. The Japanese laughed because they could not imagine a small pistol stopping a charging man. The Marines carried the Colt, often unspokenly aware that doubt itself had no place beside steel and fire. Each cleaning of the weapon, each click of the safety, each chambering of a round was a meditation, a preparation for a moment that would demand the truth. That truth was simple. In the dense, suffocating jungle, when rifles became clumsy, when charges closed the distance faster than the eye could measure, it was the Colt that could end the argument with one shot. The Japanese mocked because they had never experienced this kind of certainty. The Americans trusted the Colt, not for flair, not for beauty, but because history had proven that its bite was heavier than any boast, and its voice final. Night fell across the Guadalcanal, a dark, wet curtain pressing on the forest, muting sound, amplifying fear. Somewhere in the distance, the enemy gathered, their voices low but confident, their bayonets catching faint moonlight. 1,000 men convinced their steel could sweep aside anything before them. Evans felt the familiar weight of the Colt at his hip, its presence a steadying pulse beneath the sweat and grime. He did not speak. He did not need to. The laughter of the Japanese, sharp and clear in memory, was already beginning to fade. It would not survive the first encounter. it would not survive the bark of the tomb. 45. The shock of its recoil, the sudden terrible proof that some weapons were not to be underestimated. And in that waiting, in that quiet, oppressive night before the clash, every Marine who carried a Colt knew something the enemy did not. The weapon was patient, unyielding, and deadly, and it would demand respect long before the battle ended. The first clash came not with fanfare, but with the sudden raw chaos of men meeting in close quarters, Japanese troops, confident in their training and armed with long rifles and gleaming bayonets, advanced through the thick, suffocating jungle. Each step was measured, each voice a low murmur of anticipation. They did not see the Americans hidden in the shadows, wet with sweat, breathing in the damp, heavy air, listening to the rustle of leaves and the subtle shift of enemy boots. Charles Evans crouched low, Colt in hand, the metal cold against his palm, its weight both familiar and comforting. He could almost sense the eyes of the laughing soldiers from weeks before, imagining their derision echoing across the tangled undergrowth. That laughter had not lasted long in memory. It had already been replaced by caution, though they did not yet know it. The jungle itself seemed to lean forward, thick vines closing in, mud sucking at boots, humidity pressing against skin, masking sound but amplifying fear. And then the first shout came, the signal of movement, the sound of steel scraping on stone, the unmistakable rhythm of a charge. It was close, too close for rifles to be as effective as men believed. In the half-light, shapes moved between the trees, shadows of men intent on reaching the foxholes before a single shot could stop them. Evans felt the trigger beneath his fingers, felt the familiar click that separated hesitation from action. One breath, one heartbeat, one swing of the Colt, and the first Japanese soldier fell. The recoil slammed through his arm, but the effect was immediate, undeniable. A man who had laughed weeks ago now lay sprawled in the mud, momentum broken, the shock of the pistol's power etched into the line of his body. Another followed, charging blindly through the dense foliage, and Evans fired again. Each pull of the trigger was a punctuation mark, a statement that the weapon carried more than steel. It carried proof. Around him, Marines mirrored the moment. Rifles jammed, grenades had run dry, but the pistols spoke where other weapons could not. The dense undergrowth, the oppressive darkness, the chaos of close combat made every round count at 7 heavy bullets, each a promise of sudden finality, turned the tide in seconds that felt like hours. The Japanese, trained to respect discipline and the authority of steel, faltered. Confusion spread through their ranks. Screams mixed with the crack of the pistols, and laughter that had once echoed confidently was replaced by disbelief. Their doctrine did not account for this. The Colt was more than a tool, it was a disruptor of expectations. Evans saw a corporal beside him move with quiet precision, Colt raised, clearing a bunker where shadows stirred. The flash illuminated fear on the faces of attackers, and one by one the momentum of the charge collapsed. There were no dramatic shouts of victory, no exaggerated bravado, only the methodical, unforgiving cadence of a weapon designed to stop. The Colt demanded nothing less than attention. And in that moment, the Japanese learned a truth they could not have imagined. Size and tradition alone could not withstand force and certainty. Throughout the night, the Marines adapted, instinctively understanding how to pair their rifles with their sidearms. In open stretches, rifles controlled distance. In the dense black of the jungle, the Colt dictated survival. Men who had once doubted its relevance now treated it as a lifeline. Fingers brushed the cold steel compulsively, checking the chamber, counting the rounds, feeling the pulse of the metal beneath their skin. Every click, every flash, every recoil carried lessons that no lecture could teach. It was not just the sound that silenced the enemy, it was the knowledge, brutal and immediate, that one precise shot could end a man's advance. The Japanese, though relentless, began to hesitate. Their charges slowed, their formations frayed. Officers shouted orders, but fear had already rooted in the minds of their men. They had not faced rifles jammed in the mud, grenades scattered by rain, and pistols that struck with the certainty of falling hammers. Across the battlefield, Evans and his comrades became instruments of that certainty, their Colts barking in measured fury, sending shockwaves of disbelief through an enemy that had thought victory inevitable. Each encounter reinforced the weapon's reputation. Word spread quickly among the Marines. She'll stop them cold. One shot and they don't move. Jokes remained, but they were tempered with awe, a recognition of the lethal truth carried at every hip. By the first dawn, the laughter of Japanese troops had vanished. In its place came caution, whispered among men who had learned that their enemies were no longer relying on bluff or chance. The Colt had become more than steel. It had become a statement, an unspoken command that the battlefield obeyed. Evans, wiping his sweat-streaked face with a sleeve, felt the weight of the weapon settle against his hip. The Colt was patient, but it required focus. It demanded precision. Each pull of the trigger was not just action. It was testimony, a line drawn in mud and blood between survival and death. And though the Marines still feared the jungle, still knew the limits of their own strength, the weapon at their side carried them farther than courage alone could take them. By mid-morning, the battle had shifted. The Japanese retreated in broken lines, their confidence eroded, their discipline disrupted by an invisible force they could not comprehend. The Colt's presence was felt even where its barrel had not yet discharged. Its reputation preceded it. Soldiers whispered among themselves, sharing tales of close encounters where a single shot had saved a foxhole, a machine gun nest, a life. Each story reinforced the same truth. The weapon once dismissed as clumsy, obsolete, and laughable was now a sentinel of survival. Evans looked across the small clearing, the jungle still trembling, with echoes of struggle. He could almost hear the laughter that had preceded this fight, fading, replaced by a silence heavy with respect. The Colt had spoken first, and the jungle had listened. Each round fired, each body felled, each pause in the chaos reaffirmed what the Marines had always suspected. In the thick, suffocating, unrelenting wild of the Pacific, the Colt 45 was more than a weapon. It was certainty, a steel promise that in the moments where nothing else could save a man, one shot could end the fight and claim the truth. By the time the sun broke fully over Guadalcanal, the Japanese had learned it in the only way they could, through the absolute devastating language of a pistol that refused to be ignored. The Colt was no longer a joke. It was the arbiter of life and death, and in its echo, laughter had died. The Colt 45 did not merely stop men, it reshaped the rhythm of battle. In the dense, suffocating jungles of the Pacific, where visibility was measured in feet and every shadow could hide a blade, rifles became cumbersome, their length a liability. Grenades could be thrown only so far, smoke and confusion limiting their usefulness. The Japanese, trained for open-field discipline, for the elegant sweep of bayonets, now faced chaos that none of their doctrine could prepare them for. The Marines, sweat-soaked, mud-streaked, and unshaken by fatigue, had discovered something the enemy could not. A weapon that could respond as quickly as the threat, a metal extension of survival. Charles Evans moved through the undergrowth, Colt in hand, ears alert to every snap of twigs, every rustle of leaves. He could feel the enemy before he could see them, each step measured, each pause deliberate. Then a sudden movement, a flash of green uniform, the glint of steel, an instinct took over. Evans squeezed the trigger. The first Japanese soldier went down instantly, momentum cut short, the shock of the round visible in the way his body collapsed into the mud. Another followed, lunging too close, and the same result. The sound of the pistol, sharp and commanding, rang out through the trees, cutting through the hum of insects and distant gunfire. Around him, Marines mirrored his actions. Where rifles jammed, where bayonets would have been useless, the Colt spoke with authority. 7 rounds were all that each Marine had, but each round carried the promise of survival. The jungle, oppressive and endless, had no room for hesitation, and the Colt demanded none. By mid-afternoon, the Japanese were reeling. Their charges faltered. Officers barked commands that were ignored by men who had learned fear in the instant of steel meeting flesh. Laughter that had once been confident now turned to whispers of disbelief. The Marines shared glances, brief acknowledgments, silent nods of respect. The Colt was more than a weapon. It was a message. Every encounter, every fallen attacker reinforced the same lesson. Underestimate it at your peril. Evans remembered the early nights. The quiet moments where he had cleaned the pistol, feeling the weight of history in his hands. Each click of the safety, each chambering of a round, each pull of the trigger had been a meditation on certainty. The Colt did not ask for respect. It demanded it through action. By the time the sun dipped toward the horizon, the Japanese had learned to fear the weapon they had once laughed at. Accounts filtered through the lines, whispered stories of charges stopped, of foxholes held against impossible odds, of men saved by a single, decisive shot. Evans and his comrades carried these stories silently, letting the battlefield teach the lessons while the enemy struggled to adapt. It was close combat, unforgiving and immediate. The jungle amplified every sound, every movement, every misstep. And in that chaos, the Colt proved relentless. In the confined spaces of dugouts, in the tight corridors of caves, the rifle's length became a hindrance. Grenades could only do so much. But the Colt fit the hand, the weapon ready for the split-second decisions that define life or death. Evans fired with precision, each shot deliberate, each round a sentence that could not be argued with. The Japanese learned to pause, to hesitate, to fear. Their bayonets gleamed, but their steel meant nothing against the blunt truth of a 45 caliber slug. Night fell, but the combat did not cease. The Marines adapted to darkness, relying on the steady rhythm of the pistol to guide them through shadows that hid enemies just a few feet away. The Colt became the arbiter in these moments, the measure of who would live and who would fall. Each round emptied brought tension, a reminder that survival depended on skill, timing, and the courage to act. Stories of close calls circulated quickly. A Marine who had defended a machine gun nest with 7 rounds. A radio operator fending off a bayonet rush alone. Evans himself, shaking from adrenaline, understanding in a way no lesson could teach that the weapon at his hip was the difference between life and death. The legend of the Colt grew quietly but swiftly. Even as reinforcements arrived, fresh soldiers looked upon the sidearm with doubt. Veterans did not mock. They handed out spare magazines and allowed the lessons of combat to speak, and those lessons spoke loudly. By Saipan, by Tarawa, by Peleliu, the Japanese no longer laughed. They whispered of the weapon, of the Marines who wielded it, of the sudden, shocking proof that no charge could withstand its authority. The Colt had transformed from an object of ridicule into a symbol of absolute mechanical certainty. Evans, as he moved through another mud-slicked trench, cleaned the Colt with deliberate care, understanding that the weight of its steel carried not just firepower, but responsibility. The weapon required respect because it delivered finality. Each round was a verdict, each shot a lesson etched into the jungle floor. Men who had once doubted its relevance now polished it religiously, checked it obsessively, carried it as a talisman of survival. The Japanese, steeped in the pride of their own traditions, could only marvel at its simplicity, its precision, its unyielding capacity to decide a battle in moments where numbers and courage alone should have been enough. By the time Evans rested his head at night, he felt the echo of the day's battle lingering in his hands, in his wrist, in the muscles of his arm. The Colt had spoken first, and the jungle had listened. Laughter had died, replaced by the quiet, chilling understanding of inevitability. The jungle seemed to close in, dense and unyielding, as if it itself were testing the Marines. Every footstep was a negotiation with mud, every breath heavy with humidity, every movement shadowed by the constant risk of ambush. Charles Evans, Colt 45 in hand, moved with quiet precision, aware of how fragile life had become in these islands of sweat, salt, and steel. The Japanese were relentless, their charges driven by discipline and the pride of men who had been trained to fear nothing. Yet the moment they encountered the Marines armed with the Colt, their confidence faltered. What had once been laughter became disbelief, then fear. One shot changed everything. One pull of the trigger, and the rhythm of the enemy's assault shattered. In the close quarters of the jungle, where rifles could not point fast enough and bayonets could not find their mark through dense foliage, the Colt became the voice of certainty. Evans fired, the heavy recoil jarring his arm, but confirming the truth he had learned through practice and instinct. Each fallen soldier, each sudden silence, reinforced a lesson no manual could teach. Underestimating the weapon was fatal. Around him, Other Marines mirrored his movements. Their pistols barked through the thick shadows, and slowly the chaos began to bend to order. The enemy could no longer rely on the predictability of their charge. Their formations broke, their pace faltered, and their fear became a tangible weight in the air. The Colt's reputation, once merely whispered in the lines of Marines, now traveled ahead of them. An invisible force reshaping the battlefield. Evans had seen it firsthand. A lieutenant who had held a machine gun nest with only 7 heavy rounds, a corporal who had cleared a bunker with precise, deliberate shots. Stories of such encounters spread quietly through the ranks, turning doubt into reverent acknowledgement. By the second day of engagement, even the most skeptical replacements understood the pistol's significance. They saw how it could stop momentum in an instant, how it turned numbers and ferocity into hesitation and retreat. The Japanese, trained to value courage and steel, could not fathom the absolute certainty of a weapon that acted faster than expectation, striking with finality where precision alone was not enough. Each encounter deepened the legend. Evans, standing in a clearing littered with the remnants of broken charges, could hear the echo of the weapon's authority long after the echoes of battle had faded. The Colt did not merely stop men, it dictated the terms of survival. And yet, it demanded respect. Every recoil reminded a Marine that the pistol was unforgiving. Every flash burned in the night a lesson in consequence. Those who wielded it learned quickly that it was not ornamental, not a symbol of bravado, but a tool that required the steadiness of mind and clarity of purpose. Even laughter among the Americans changed. No longer did it stem from disbelief. It was tempered with awe, a quiet acknowledgement of the lethal reality resting in the palms of their hands. The Japanese, for their part, began to whisper among themselves, recording in journals the strange, terrifying power of this weapon. Accounts describe soldiers felled instantly, charges broken mid-stride, momentum stopped as though by invisible hands. The Colt had become more than a tool. It was a disruptor of expectation, a weapon that reshaped the way battle was fought on these islands. Evans moved through a cave system, narrow and suffocating, where rifles were useless and grenades could only do so much. Shadows shifted in the darkness, and every movement brought the risk of sudden death. He raised the Colt, fired, and the result was immediate. One enemy fell, another froze, and the legend grew in the minds of both friend and foe Marines, who once treated the pistol as secondary began to carry it as if it were an extension of themselves. Fingers brushed the grip not out of affection, but necessity. The Colt's presence became a rhythm, a silent guidance in the chaos of combat. By the time night fell across Saipan, Evans and his comrades understood that survival in the Pacific was measured not only in courage, but in the weight of the weapon at their hip, the certainty it delivered, and the quickness with which it could turn expectation into reality. Japanese commanders, once confident in the efficacy of disciplined charges and long rifles, now hesitated. Their men, who had been taught to advance without question, stumbled over the unexpected precision of the American sidearm. The Colt 45 had transformed the battlefield into a place where skill, presence of mind, and a single well-placed shot could decide outcomes previously assumed to be inevitable. Evans, sitting briefly in a trench, felt the sweat running down his back, the heat pressing against his body, the hum of insects filling the night, and yet he felt steadiness in his hand. The Colt was patient, but it demanded readiness. Every round chambered carried a promise. Survivor Fall, the jungle, thick with anticipation, seemed to respect the metal as much as the men who wielded it. By the next morning, the Japanese had stopped laughing entirely. They recorded the events, the deaths, the precise, terrifying effectiveness of a pistol they had mocked. What had begun as amusement turned to respect, and in some cases, bitter acknowledgement. The Colt 45 had proven itself, and in the hands of Marines who understood its language, it became an extension of will, a force that turned fear into control, uncertainty into action. Evans cleaned the weapon with deliberate care, knowing the moments ahead would demand the same precision, the same unwavering attention.